In the year 1000, in a river valley in what is now southern Peru, a mother wrapped a strip of cloth around her newborn's skull. She would do this every day, tightening it slightly more each time for close to 4 years. By the time the child could walk and speak, the shape of their head would be permanently altered, stretched upward and back, elongated into a form no human skull naturally takes. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't an accident. It was one of the most widespread, most deliberate and least understood body modification practices in human history. Most people assume skull deformation was a strange, isolated ritual practiced by one or two obscure tribes. They're wrong. Evidence of intentional cranial shaping has been found on nearly every inhabited continent, from the Huns of Central Asia to the Maya of Mesoamerica, from ancient Egypt to the highlands of France, from Australia to the Pacific Northwest. Cultures with no contact with one another, separated by oceans and thousands of years, independently arrived at the same practice, reshaping the human head before it had a chance to grow on its own. Why would so many unrelated societies across the entire span of human civilization choose to permanently alter the one part of the body that houses the brain? What did they think they were doing to the people whose skulls they shaped? And what does the choice to do this to your own children generation after generation actually reveal about how ancient humans understood status, beauty, and the mind itself? The stranger part isn't that they did it. The stranger part is what happens when you look closely at what they believed it would accomplish. Cranial deformation, sometimes called artificial cranial shaping, is not a myth or an exaggeration passed down through folklore. It's one of the best documented practices in physical anthropology, because unlike most ancient customs, it leaves permanent evidence. Bone remembers. Archaeologists don't have to guess whether it happened. They can hold the skull in their hands. What researchers found was that the practice required almost nothing in terms of tools or technology. A board pressed against the back of an infant's head. Cloth bindings wrapped tightly around the skull. A cradleboard that held the baby's head in a fixed position for months. That's it. No surgery, no instruments, no medical knowledge in the modern sense. Just sustained, repeated pressure applied during a narrow window of life, because an infant's skull is not yet fused into rigid plates. It's made of separate bones connected by soft, flexible tissue called fontanelles, which don't fully close until a child is around 2 years old. This is the detail most people miss. Skull shaping wasn't cruelty in the way it might look to modern eyes. It exploited a real biological window, a period when the skull is soft enough to be reshaped without breaking, without obvious pain signals of the kind an adult would experience, and without damaging the brain inside it. Ancient parents across dozens of unconnected cultures had independently discovered the exact same anatomical fact, that a baby's head is temporarily moldable, and that the shape it settles into is permanent once the bone hardens. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is that this knowledge, this precise understanding of infant skull development, existed in societies with no writing system, no anatomical textbooks, and no way to communicate their discovery to each other across oceans. And yet the technique, bind, press, wait, shows up almost identically from Peru to Sudan to southern France. Convergent invention on this scale doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a practice is valuable enough and visible enough that it gets rediscovered again and again. The question isn't whether ancient humans could do this. The question is why they thought it was worth doing at all, to their own children deliberately for years at a time. To understand why, researchers had to look at where the practice was most extreme, and the answer is the Paracas culture of the southern coast of Peru, active roughly 2,500 years ago. The Paracas produced some of the most dramatically elongated skulls ever recovered, some stretched to nearly twice the volume of a typical human skull. When these remains were first excavated in the 1920s by archaeologist Julio Tello, the shapes were so extreme that they triggered wild theories, that the Paracas were a separate human subspecies, or the descendants of non-human visitors. Modern genetic testing has closed that door. DNA analysis conducted on Paracas remains confirms they were fully human, biologically identical to neighboring Andean populations. The elongation was not natural. It was constructed deliberately from birth, using tight wrapping and boards applied over years. So if the shape wasn't biological, what was it for? This is where the evidence gets more interesting than the myth. Bioarchaeologist Corey Ragsdale, who has studied cranial modification across multiple ancient South American sites, found that the specific shape a skull was molded into wasn't random. It correlated with social groups. Different valleys, different lineages, different status classes produced different head shapes. A rounded, high-back deformation might mark one community, an elongated, tapering shape might mark another. The skull became a permanent, unremovable badge of identity, visible from birth to death, that no one could fake, forge, or hide. This pattern repeats far beyond Peru. Among the Huns, who swept across Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries, elite burials frequently show pronounced cranial elongation, while lower status graves show far less modification or none at all. Among the Maya, elongated foreheads were associated with the maize god and with nobility. Priests and rulers depicted in stone carvings and painted ceramics consistently show sloped, elongated heads, a look that ordinary farmers did not share. In ancient Egypt, the family of Akhenaten, most famously his daughters and possibly Nefertiti herself, are shown in art with elongated skulls, and while debate continues over whether this reflects real deformation or artistic style, skeletal evidence from the period suggests the practice existed among Egyptian elites as well. What researchers discovered again and again across cultures with no contact with one another was the same underlying logic. An altered skull was not a medical procedure. It was a message written directly onto the body, one that could never be taken off, edited, or hidden. In a world without photographs, without written records accessible to most people, without any reliable way to prove your lineage at a glance, a permanently shaped head did that job instantly. But status wasn't the whole story. Here's where it gets interesting. Among the Chinookan peoples of the Pacific Northwest, cranial flattening, pressing a board against the forehead of an infant strapped to a cradle board, wasn't just a marker of prestige. It was a marker of freedom itself. Among the Chinook in neighboring groups, a flattened, sloped forehead identified a person as freeborn. An unmodified, round skull marked someone as enslaved. The shape of a person's head, decided in the first months of their life, determined how they would be treated for the rest of it. Whether they could own property, whether they could marry freely, whether they were considered fully human within their own society. A newborn had no say in the matter, yet the decision made by their parents in infancy would define their entire social existence. This wasn't cosmetic. It was a caste system written directly into bone. And then something unexpected happened when researchers started asking a harder question. Did any of this affect the brain itself? For decades, the assumption, often unspoken, sometimes explicit in early 20th century anthropology, was that head binding must have damaged cognitive ability. It fit a colonial-era bias that framed the practice as primitive and harmful. But when modern researchers actually tested this assumption against the evidence, it fell apart. Studies examining cranial capacity in deformed versus non-deformed skulls from the same populations found that while the shape changed dramatically, the total internal volume of the skull, and by extension the space available for the brain, remained essentially unchanged. The brain doesn't get compressed. It gets redirected. Reshaped along with the bone that contains it, expanding into whatever space the binding leaves available. Elongate the back and top of the skull, and the brain grows to fill that elongated space instead of its typical rounded form. This is one of the more remarkable findings in the entire field. The human brain, at least in early development, is not rigidly fixed to a single shape. It's plastic enough to develop normally inside a radically altered skull, so long as total volume is preserved. Ancient parents, without any concept of neuroscience, were unknowingly running a multi-generational experiment in developmental plasticity, and the outcome, as far as modern skeletal and limited cognitive evidence can show, was that deformation reshaped appearance without measurably impairing brain function. The deeper mystery isn't that they got away with it. It's that their instinctive understanding of infant development, vague, ritualized, inherited through tradition rather than science, happened to align with a biological reality researchers wouldn't formally confirm for thousands of years. But the practice becomes stranger still when you look at how long it survived and where. Most people picture cranial deformation as something that ended with the ancient world, Peru, Egypt, the Huns, all safely distant in time. That's not accurate either. In the Toulouse region of southern France, a practice known as deformation toulousaine persisted among rural families well into the 19th and even early 20th century. Infants had their heads wrapped tightly with cloth bandeaus, sometimes reinforced with padding, for months after birth. Unlike the elite status markers of Peru or the Maya, this version had a completely different justification. French peasant families believed it protected infants, strengthened them, and prepared their heads for the physical demands of farm labor. The elongated shape it produced was considered a sign of a hard-working, well-cared-for child. French physicians in the 1800s documented the practice with growing alarm, and by the early 20th century it had largely died out, not through law, but through changing medical opinion and shifting fashions in child rearing. The last confirmed cases in France date to as late as the 1950s. That means intentional skull deformation, a practice most people assume vanished with the pyramids, was still being performed on newborn infants within living memory of people alive today. The mystery deepens again when you look at Vanuatu in the South Pacific, where cranial elongation continued on the island of Tamman well into the 20th century and in some accounts into recent decades. There, the practice was tied not to slavery or agricultural labor, but to spiritual belief. An elongated skull was thought to bring a person closer to the ancestors, to project wisdom and spiritual authority within the community. Village elders describe it as a mark of respect performed with pride, not something imposed through coercion, offering a strikingly different emotional context from the caste-based systems of the Pacific Northwest just a few thousand miles away. So the same physical act, binding an infant's skull for months or years, produced completely different meanings depending entirely on the culture performing it. In Peru it signaled lineage. Among the Huns, it signaled elite warrior status, and some historians argue the Huns' famously terrifying appearance in Roman accounts was amplified by these deliberately elongated skulls, engineered to make warriors look otherworldly and more frightening on the battlefield. In the Pacific Northwest, it signaled freedom versus bondage. In rural France, it signaled parental diligence and physical readiness for labor. In Vanuatu, it signaled spiritual closeness to ancestors. One biological technique. 5 entirely different belief systems, invented independently, layered onto the exact same act. What researchers found when they stepped back and compared all of these cases side by side, is that cranial deformation wasn't really about the skull at all. It was a canvas. Ancient and not-so-ancient societies used the one part of the human body that's biologically moldable in infancy, and onto it they projected whatever their culture valued most: power, purity, protection, labor, or the divine. That's when the mystery deepened even further, because the practice wasn't confined to Eurasia, the Americas, and the Pacific. In Central Africa, the Mangbetu people of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo practiced a form of cranial elongation called lipambo, achieved by wrapping an infant's head with tight raffia fiber bindings starting at birth. Mangbetu oral tradition and colonial-era ethnographic accounts describe the elongated skull as a symbol of beauty, intelligence, and royal lineage. Women with the most pronounced elongation, often exaggerated further with elaborate woven hairstyles built up around the shape, were considered the most desirable and were frequently associated with the ruling class. Belgian colonial photographers documented Mangbetu women with lipambo well into the early 20th century, making it one of the more recently and thoroughly photographed examples of the practice, existing at almost the same moment in history as the last deformation Tolosane cases in rural France. Two societies, thousands of miles apart, both still deliberately reshaping infant skulls as European industrial modernity was already reaching much of the rest of the world. What made researchers take the Mangbetu case seriously as more than a curiosity was the detail that elongation there was explicitly linked to perceived intelligence. Community accounts recorded by anthropologists held that a longer head housed a larger, more capable brain, a folk theory of cranial capacity that, as with the Paracas centuries earlier, turned out to align with a real anatomical truth researchers wouldn't confirm scientifically for generations. That total brain volume is preserved under elongation, even though the belief itself, that longer literally meant smarter, was not accurate in any measurable sense. The Mangbetu had, independently, landed on the same partially correct intuition that Andean parents had reached 2,000 years earlier on a different continent, with no possible contact between the two traditions. The pattern escalates once more when you turn to how these societies protected the practice from failure. Cranial shaping wasn't a single event, it required years of sustained, correctly timed pressure, and getting it wrong carried real risk. Apply too much force too quickly and infant skulls, while pliable, can suffer fractures or abnormal pressure on the brain beneath. Bioarchaeological surveys of deformed skulls occasionally do show evidence of related bone trauma or asymmetry consistent with binding that was inconsistent or overly aggressive. This means the practice demanded a level of specialized transmitted knowledge, likely held by specific caregivers, midwives, or elder women within a community, about exactly how much pressure, applied how often, over what span of months, would achieve the desired shape without causing serious harm. In societies without written records, this knowledge had to be preserved entirely through direct apprenticeship, generation after generation, for the practice to continue safely for over 2,000 years in some regions. A single broken chain of transmission could have meant the knowledge and the risk calculus behind it was lost, yet it wasn't, not in Peru, not in Vanuatu, not in Central Africa for millennia. And that raises the bigger mystery underneath all of the individual cases. Why would evolution or culture or both converge so reliably on using the skull specifically, rather than any other part of the body, as the primary canvas for permanent social signaling in infancy? The answer researchers keep arriving at is visibility. The human skull is the one part of the body that is almost never covered, almost never hidden, and is the first thing another person perceives in any face-to-face encounter. Unlike a tattoo which can be covered by clothing or a filed tooth, which is only visible when someone speaks, a deformed skull announces itself constantly from every angle to everyone for an entire lifetime. It cannot be temporarily removed for convenience and cannot be easily faked by an outsider trying to claim status they weren't born into, because the window to create it closes forever after early childhood. In evolutionary terms, this makes it what biologists studying honest signaling call a costly and unforgeable signal, a marker of group identity that is expensive enough and permanent enough that only genuine members of a lineage, caste, or belief system would have undergone it as infants, with no ability to opt in later as adults for personal gain. This is the same underlying logic that shows up in radically different corners of the animal kingdom, wherever biologists study markers that reliably communicate identity or fitness. The signal has to be costly to fake for it to be trusted. Ancient humans, without any formal theory of signaling, arrived at a version of this principle through the one modification available to them that fit the requirements. Irreversible, visible from birth, and impossible to counterfeit in adulthood. Which means every one of these cultures, Paracas, Hun, Maya, Chinookan, Mangbetu, Vanuatu, rural French, was independently solving the exact same evolutionary and social problem. How do you make identity, status, or belonging permanent, visible, and impossible to fake, using only what the human body itself provides? And every one of them landed on the same organ, the skull, during the single narrow window in which it could still be shaped. There's one more layer to this that makes the pattern harder to dismiss as coincidence. In several of these traditions, the practice wasn't only about the living, it extended a claim over the dead. Paracas elite burials show individuals interred with their deformed skulls displayed prominently, sometimes alongside trophy heads taken from rival groups, whose skulls were left deliberately unmodified. The contrast was the point. An unaltered head marked an outsider, an enemy, someone who had never belonged. A shaped head marked someone who belonged so completely that the marking began before they could walk or speak, and it would still be visible on their skeleton thousands of years after everyone who had known them was gone. In a very real sense, these societies were encoding belonging into the skeleton itself, betting that identity should outlast memory, outlast language, outlast the culture that created it, and in the case of the Paracas, the Huns, the Maya, and the Chinook, it did. We are still reading that message today, on bone, in the near-total absence of any other record of who these people believe themselves to be. Modern forensic anthropology has added one final wrinkle to this picture. Because deformed skulls are so visually distinctive, they were historically easy to misclassify. Early 20th century excavators sometimes mistook pathological skull conditions, like craniosynostosis, a disorder where an infant's skull plates fuse too early and naturally, for deliberate cultural deformation, and vice versa. Distinguishing the two required close study of the specific pattern of bone remodeling, since intentional binding leaves a signature of gradual, symmetrical pressure-based reshaping, while pathological fusion leaves a different, less uniform mark. Getting this distinction right mattered enormously because conflating the two erased the deliberate, skilled, and socially meaningful nature of what these cultures were actually doing to their children, reducing an intentional, multi-generational cultural technology to a medical accident. The deeper question is what this practice reveals about the species doing it, not just the cultures that performed it. Human infants are born more helpless for longer than almost any other animal on Earth. A newborn wildebeest stands and runs within minutes of birth. A human infant can't even hold up its own head. Evolutionary biologists explain this through what's sometimes called the obstetric dilemma. The human brain grew so large, so fast over the course of our evolution, that we had to be born before our skulls finished developing, simply to fit through the birth canal at all. The trade-off is that human skulls arrive soft, unfused, and unfinished. A biological compromise between brain size and childbirth that no other primate shares to the same degree. What ancient cultures discovered, likely by accident at first, is that this evolutionary compromise, this narrow, vulnerable window of unfinished bone, was also an opportunity. The same softness that makes human birth so dangerous is the same softness that makes human identity so moldable. We are the only species that turned a biological vulnerability into a canvas for meaning. No other animal takes the literal physical shape of its offspring's skull and uses it to encode caste, freedom, spiritual rank, or lineage. That capacity required something uniquely human, the ability to hold an idea, status, belonging, sacredness, abstract enough that it could be projected onto bone, and important enough that parents would commit years of daily effort to inscribing it permanently onto a child who couldn't consent and wouldn't remember the process. This connects to something larger about human consciousness itself. We are a species that doesn't just live inside our bodies. We use our bodies to tell stories about who we are, before we're even old enough to understand the story being told. Tattoos, scarification, filed teeth, foot binding, corseting, even modern practices like orthodontics and cosmetic surgery, all sit on the same evolutionary continuum that began quite literally at the skull, reshaping the body to align it with a belief about what that body should mean to others. Skull deformation is simply the oldest, most permanent, and most unmistakable version of an impulse that never went away. We stopped binding heads mostly, but we never stopped believing that the body is something to be shaped, marked, and read by others as a signal of who we are. And that reframes the entire mystery. This was never really a story about ancient people doing something strange to their children. It's a story about how deeply, how universally, and how early the human need to belong, to be permanently and visibly marked as part of something, asserts itself. It starts before memory. It starts before language. In dozens of cultures across thousands of years and every inhabited continent, it started before a child could even lift their own head. Somewhere in the Andes, roughly 2,000 years ago, a mother pressed cloth against her newborn's skull for the first time. She had no way of knowing that researchers would one day hold that same skull in gloved hands, run it through a CT scanner, and confirm that the brain inside it had grown normally, undamaged, exactly as it would have without the binding. She had no way of knowing that her decision, repeated daily for years, would outlast her language, her city, her entire civilization, that it would still be legible 2,000 years later as a message, even after everyone who could have explained it in words was gone. She wasn't trying to speak to the future. She was trying to make sure her child would never be mistaken, in a single glance, for someone who didn't belong. That's the part that lingers. Every one of these skulls, from Peru, from the Hun graves of the Eurasian steppe, from the coast of Vanuatu, from a quiet farmhouse in 19th century France, is a message written in bone by someone who never expected it to be read this far into the future, by strangers, in a language and a world they couldn't have imagined. And the message, translated across every culture that ever practiced it, comes out roughly the same. This child is one of us. Look at them and you will know it permanently before they ever say a word. Maybe that's the real reason this practice appears again and again, independently, across a species scattered over every continent on Earth. Not because ancient humans were strange or primitive or fundamentally different from us, but because the need underneath it, the need to belong somewhere permanently and visibly, never actually left. We just stopped writing it on the skull. We started writing it everywhere else instead, in the way we dress, the way we speak, the symbols we choose to display, the groups we announce ourselves as part of the moment someone looks at us. The material changed. The impulse didn't. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more. See you in the next one.